So my name is Lizzie. I have a problem with micro supply of breast milk for breastfeeding, and I only found this out after my son was a month old, and I just couldn't cope with it mentally to deal with all the emotions. I always felt like every time I tried to nurse him, it felt like failure. So I decided that I couldn't do it anymore, so we just bottle fed him. But I found out a lot whilst researching about my condition and how to maximise supply and things like that. So I decided that when I got pregnant again that I would try to breastfeed her. And I've just finished breastfeeding her. We made it to 5 months, which is a really big achievement for me. I wish I could have gone longer, but actually it was just starting to get a bit impractical, and actually I felt a lot of closure about the timing. So yeah, so basically I have hyperplasia in my breasts, which means that they haven't developed properly, and that was how I knew that I actually might have problems with producing milk, because a lactation consultant saw my breasts and saw that they were very typical of that condition and said, "Oh, have you been having trouble with breastfeeding?" Because I'd gone because of a potential tongue tie with my first son, which is what we thought the root with all the problems was. Boy, did I wish it was. So I started looking into hyperplasia, and got onto IGT as well, insufficient glandular tissue, and I think I have probably a mixture of the two. So if you've got hyperplasia, it doesn't mean you necessarily also have IGT, but I do think I have both conditions. The IGT probably brought on by the hyperplasia. So my situation is that my left breast doesn't produce anything at all. The maximum I ever got was just drops, and my right, the maximum I ever saw that I produced by my regular pumping and things like that, on a good day was 30 mil, and I'd have that for one session in the morning, and then it would get less and less and less throughout the day, to the point where it was drops at my best at the end of the day. So a real micro supply, and I knew that it wouldn't get better. I could maximise it by giving my breasts as much stimulation as possible, by either pumping or by the SNS. So I tried doing a bit of both to sort of really maximise it, but actually we got on so well with the SNS that we decided that pumping just was taking me away from my toddler and my baby, and actually every time I pumped it felt like I was taking that bit of milk away from directly nursing it to her. So for me, SNS was an absolute lifesaver. Most of you listening probably know that SNS stands for Supplemental Nursing System. So yeah, let me get on to sort of how we started. So first of all, I bought, before I actually gave birth the second time, the Medela Supplemental Nursing System. I chose this because I wasn't confident enough to make my own, even though I'd seen that a lot of people had made their own, and because I'm in the UK, I couldn't get hold of Lactaid. I looked a little bit into I think it says Hacker, from New Zealand, who make the silicone pump. They've also now developed one which is quite a lot cheaper as well. The Medela one is not cheap, and to be honest, I didn't get on with it at all. I don't think it's very good. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. The positives of it is that it comes in a set, so you have instructions and you can follow instructions. Another positive is that the tubes are really thin, so it's really good for newborn, because the flow is nice and slow. It does come with 3 different speeds of flowing. I went for the middle one straight away, which worked quite well in terms of speed, and when I got it in right and when I set it up right, it did work good. I'll probably show you in a minute how to set it all up, because I'm going to show you cleaning and setup by the sink so that you can really see how to do all of that. So anyway, I had a lot of problems with this. It kept leaking, it kept not letting the milk go through even when it really should, and I troubleshooted it loads and it still wasn't working. So I eventually gave up on that and decided that I could probably make a better one. So I went on to using just any bottle, and made the hole slightly larger in the teat. I had it sort of just sticking down just because it's easier to get the tube in and out, but it's just a normal teat of a normal bottle, and you just make the hole just slightly bigger to fit the tube through. So at first I used a nasogastric tube, which I got from the hospital that I gave birth in, and that I was working with a breastfeeding consultant, and she managed to get me some for us to be able to have a go to see if we liked it. I also ordered these from Canada, so they took a little while to come, not ages actually. It was really, I was quite impressed. And then I just used this instead. So if you wanted to make your own SNS, which to be honest I would probably recommend, I've got the details here of the stuff that I've used, because then literally all you do is poke the tube through, pop that bit in the bottom, and if you've done a good job on making the hole nice and small, actually it's pretty spill proof. It would obviously leak if you left it upside down for ages, but I haven't actually spilt any, which has been really, really good. Trying to think if there's anything else you probably want to know beforehand. The only thing about the tubes that I bought, so I bought these tubes, they're called 5 French or FR feeding tubes, and these are the long 36-inch ones. They also do 15-inch ones, but I'd really recommend getting the long 36-inch. The only issue that you might have with that is if you're using an SNS because your baby has a weak suck, the longer the tube, the harder it is for your baby to get the milk out. So if you don't know that your child is good at sucking, then you possibly would want the shorter one. But if you can get away with getting the longer one, I'd really recommend that, because the only problem with it is that when it comes, and I'll show you a close-up later, the holes where the milk comes out aren't right at the end. So then when it comes to cleaning it, the end is really, really hard to clean, and build-up of old milk happens really, really quickly. So what we did instead was cut the end off to make just a normal hole right at the end, because then it's a lot easier to flush it out and get rid of all the milk. So that's the only issue with it. You can also get syringes to put in it as well, but actually I'll show you how I clean it later. I didn't buy any syringes. So that is the 5 French feeding tube, long 36 inch, and I bought it from a company called Birth Supplies Canada, and their website is midwiferysupplies.ca. So that's midwiferysupplies.ca. And I'd really recommend them. They were really cheap, really fast delivery, really reasonable shipping costs, and they deliver internationally as well. So as I say, it comes from Canada, but I got it in England. So it was really, really good. I am a member of 2 really, really good Facebook groups. There was just so much information, and I felt so much more enlightened than I would have done on my own. I definitely wouldn't have tried doing it on my own if I didn't find these groups. So the first one is IGT and Low Milk Supply Support Group. That's IGT and Low Milk Supply Support Group. That was a really, really good group, especially for anyone who has low supply. But also there's lots of people who do SNS as well. But also as well, you've got that much wider, people talk about ways to increase their milk, a lot of like pills and things that they take, advice about medical stuff, and also a lot of pumping stuff as well. So they're really good for like everything. But also as well, Supply Line Breastfeeders Support Group of Australia. That's Supply Line Breastfeeders Support Group of Australia, and that was really, really good as well. I found that nearer the end of my SNS journey, but it was really good to be able to have people who everyone did SNS. So rather than on the other group where you had to specify, I'm talking to all the SNS users here, I have a question, on that group everyone uses SNS. The only problem with that group, from my point of view, my position was that people are using SNSs for lots and lots of different reasons, including them having a really good supply that they need to teach the baby how to suck, how to breastfeed, or to just build their supply up. So it depends why you're using an SNS, but I'm in both groups, and I think together they're both brilliant. On those groups, I told people I was going to do this video and ask what people wanted to see, to know about. I'm not actually going to nurse on this video because I want it to be widely spread so people have access to it. So I'm going to put it on YouTube and on these groups as well. So I didn't really want to nurse and put it all out like that. So yeah, a few people asked me a few questions, and hopefully I'm going to cover all of it. So I would say the best and easiest SNS would be a homemade one. There's lots and lots of different ways of doing a homemade SNS, but I will show you my setup in a minute when I'm showing you my cleaning and my setting up. People asked how to use a nipple shield as well as a SNS. I only did this once, and I found it a little bit difficult, but I know the general premise, so I can let you know. So you set your SNS up like normal, and then the supply line needs to go inside the nipple shield. I apologise if any of this is wrong, especially stuff that I haven't actually done myself. Some people might be able to comment and let me know if I'm saying anything that's wrong. But the thing that I tried was putting it in there and then putting it obviously on your breast, and then that means that the baby is, for one thing, it means that you can do the supply line for babies that don't like the feeling of the supply line in their mouth. It can be a bit off-putting for some babies, especially if they're used to not having a supply line. But I went through a stage of my daughter not really wanting me to put the supply line in and being very fidgety. So I did try doing this, and it did kind of work, but then thankfully she got over it. So then I just went back to not using the nipple shield, because I didn't find it worked brilliantly. But I mean, it's definitely worth a go. That's about all I can say on that, because I haven't actually really used it, but I hope that was useful. Do you swap sides in between in each session? As I say, I don't have anything on my left, so I didn't bother. For the first little while, I would do my main side without the SNS, and then I would do it with the SNS on that side, and then I would switch over to my other side and then do the SNS. The thing I didn't like about that was that it is very fiddly, especially at the beginning, to be able to get it in, and once you get it in sweet spot, you don't want anything to move, because otherwise it might take you another 10 minutes to like get it in the right place when you're still learning. So yeah, so you definitely, if you have supply in both, you definitely want to make sure you're using both. So yeah, but again, I can't really help on that because I only have one that works. People also asked about how to do it in public. So I think one of the reasons why I was so successful this time in maintaining it is because it is hard to do it in public. I mean, it's hard to breastfeed in public. But thankfully, while I was breastfeeding my daughter, we were in lockdown, so I didn't actually need to do it in public that much because we weren't going anywhere, which was a blessing in disguise really for my breastfeeding journey. But I have done it in front of people before. I would say go for it. If it's something that you're still learning, just do it. People have a lot of questions, but actually if you're just open and honest about what you're doing, people are very confused. But actually when you start saying that you're overcoming these difficulties, they have nothing but admiration for you. So I'd encourage you to be open about it with people. I have tried doing it with someone who isn't very comfortable with people breastfeeding. I did it with a cover over me so that he would feel more comfortable. And honestly, it was the hardest thing because trying to just get her on with a cover is really hard, but trying to also get the line in is really hard. So I would say just be confident, just go for it, just be as you would be at home. The other investment that I really think is good is this cushion. It's called My Breast Friend. Where is the tag? I think it's got a label somewhere. Yeah, My Breast Friend, BREST. And the good thing about this cushion is because I was using just my sofa cushions, but then when I did start thinking about going out and about, I was like, well, I can't really take my sofa cushions, and actually they do keep moving, they're not great. So I bought another normal breastfeeding cushion, but because it was like a pillow sort of texture, it just sinks as soon as you put the weight of the baby on. It just sinks down, so they don't stay in the same position. And the one that I had for a little bit with my son as well, the shape lost its shape a lot. But saying all that, I did always buy very, very cheap ones, so it might have just been that. Someone on one of the groups I was in, I asked about the best cushion because I decided to spend a bit more to get a good one. And the one that kept being recommended was this one. But it is so expensive if you buy it new. It's like in the hundreds of pounds, especially if you need to pay for delivery and stuff as well. So I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not spending that. But thankfully, on Facebook Marketplace, someone was just selling one, and they were selling it for a couple of pounds. So I'd really recommend keeping your eye out for that. Maybe put like a notification alert to say if there's one that comes up. But the good thing about this is that it's foam, really hard foam, and it doesn't move once you put the baby on. Even my daughter now, who's 5 months, she doesn't make a dent in it at all. It's really easy to clean as well, and it goes round you, so it's got clips, and it goes round you, and because you clip it in place, it stays completely in place and doesn't move. So that's really good. And it's also got a pocket as well, which is just made for keeping your SNS in, which is brilliant. So I think what I'll do now is go over to the sink and show you the setup and the cleaning aspect of it, and then I'll talk a little bit more about tips for actually breastfeeding. Okay, so I hope that's been useful so far.